Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Still Becoming. I want to welcome you into this episode titled Trusting the Pattern. This week has been one of those weeks, and not because anything actually went wrong, but because my brain convinced me something was wrong. I'm sure those of you have been in those moments where your life is objectively moving forward, but emotionally it feels like you're standing still. And that was me this week. And, before we get into it, I just want to remind you, you can follow my journey on Instagram at stillbecoming26. There you'll find, all my workout data and, kind of just recaps after workouts. And I invite you to just, leave a comment. Let me know, if I've gotten you going or if there's anything you want to hear in particular. And I just thank you guys for following along on the podcast. So let's get into it. I had a workout this morning where I was supposed to do 4 to 5, 1600, slash almost mile repeats at about my half marathon pace currently. I mean, not currently, but, the pace I'm shooting for. Nothing crazy, nothing impossible. Pace, I've already proven I can run. And yet every single interval felt like I was introducing myself to it for the first time. I'd start too slow, I'd panic, I'd speed up, then I'd overcorrect. And I'd find myself frustrated thinking, why does this feel so stinking hard? I actually caught myself thinking, I should be better than this. And that's a dangerous sentence. Not because we shouldn't expect improvement, but because improvement almost never feels the way we imagine it. I think a lot of us believe progress should feel comfortable. Like once you've reached that level, you've unlocked it forever. Similar to like some of you that are gamers, oh, I got that special item and now I don't have to go get that again. But, that's not how it works. It's not how running works. It's not how becoming works. Sometimes your body, just it is already adapted and your mind is still catching up. Sometimes your fitness is ahead of your confidence. Sometimes experience is ahead of your emotions, and that's uncomfortable. I've noticed something else, ever since my 5K that I did a couple weeks ago. I felt flat, not injured, not exhausted, just missing that little spark. A month ago, I felt smoother, more relaxed, more alive. This week I've kind of questioned whether I was actually getting worse. Then my coach, and I talked to him once a week, this past week, he's just reminded me of something, incredibly simple. We're not peaking. Of course, I don't feel amazing. I'm carrying over 80 miles a week. I'm strength training twice a week. I've got my job, my full-time job as a therapist, massage therapist, family, kids. I'm training. I'm not tapering. The purpose right now isn't to feel incredible. It's to become incredible down the road. Those are very different things. I think that's something we forget. Social media makes it look like every workout should feel magical. Every run should feel effortless. Every week should produce a breakthrough. But, that's not how training works. That's not how becoming works. That's entertainment. Real training is surprisingly boring. For those people that are, achieving things in life that are making it look easy on Instagram, or maybe they're not posting it, and they're just getting to a place where people always question, man, how do you get there? It's not like they rolled out of bed and just did that. They'll tell you it's boring. Real training is surprisingly boring. It stacks ordinary days together until, they become extraordinary months. Most of the work isn't exciting. It's just Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, long run, go home, eat, sleep, repeat. You kind of ask yourself, why does anyone keep doing this? It's crazy. Why am I going to hit this wall over and over and over and over again? But, there's a beauty in that. There is, a purity to it, a discipline it teaches you, and something that you can't really produce anywhere else in that pure sense of yeah, it sounds boring. Eat, sleep, repeat. But it makes you more dedicated. It makes you more passionate about what you're doing. Hence why, this show is about following your passion. You know, this week I caught myself doing something I've always done. Overanalyzing, looking at the pace, looking at the splits, looking at how the workout felt. Trying to solve everything immediately, as if enough thinking could somehow, make me fitter. I've got news for myself, and for those of you out there that just get so focused in on the data, it can't make you fitter. It can tell you where you're at, give you gauges on we're improving or we're not, but unfortunately, it can't make us better. Thinking has its place, reflection matters, learning matters, but eventually, analyzing becomes another form of anxiety. You start searching for certainty that doesn't exist. And before long, you're spending more energy trying to explain your training than actually doing your training. Trying to figure out every reason as to, why, well, we can do this maybe. No, maybe we could do this. And unfortunately, it just brings about more anxiety, makes you waste more energy, and you eventually just don't have as much fun. And one thing my coach told me recently that really stuck was, he said professional athletes don't spend all day wondering if the workout worked. They trust the process in most cases. They do the session, go home, play with their kids if they have any, watch a movie, kind of lounge around, play video games, just really take a load off and just sit there and eat dinner, then wake up again and train. They have coaches and other people to do the thinking for them, and if they have questions, they'll ask them, but they're not going to spend all day doing what some of us do. I will say I loved hearing that because honestly, that's the athlete I want to become, not someone who's obsessed, someone who's committed. There's a difference. Obsession constantly asks, am I there yet? Commitment quietly says, see you tomorrow. I think that's true outside of running too. Maybe you're building a business. Maybe you're trying to save your marriage. Maybe you're raising kids. Maybe you're trying to become healthier. Most meaningful things don't reward you immediately. They reward you consistently. And consistency is incredibly ordinary. You don't usually notice it while you're living in it. You recognize it when you're looking back at it, all the moments and all the data, that result wise, that you did. And you realize, whoa, I got here because of consistency. It wasn't some magical workout. Sometimes I wish my brain would just remember, we've been here before because we have. Every season I've questioned myself. Every season I've doubted my fitness. Every season, I've wondered whether I was losing it. And every season, the work kept showing up before the confidence did. Maybe confidence isn't something we build by feeling good. Maybe confidence is simply remembering all the times we kept going anyways. That's where I'm trying to live right now. Not chasing perfect workouts, not chasing perfect feelings, just chasing another good day. Because enough good days become great seasons, and great seasons become years you never imagined possible. You might have imagined something, but certainly not that when you've stuck to it. If you're listening today, and you've been frustrated because your progress doesn't feel the way you thought it would, I just want to remind you of something. Don't confuse unfamiliar with impossible. Sometimes growth feels awkward simply because you're living at a level you've never lived at before. Your mind hasn't built a home there yet. Give it time. Keep showing up. Eventually, what feels difficult today becomes normal tomorrow. I'm trying to stop asking, why doesn't this feel any easier? And start asking, what does require of me today? Those are completely different questions. One keeps me stuck, the other keeps me moving. So this week, I'm choosing to trust the pattern, not today's emotions, not today's splits, not today's frustration, the pattern, because the pattern has earned my trust. And if I keep stacking these ordinary days together, one day I'll look back and realize something extraordinary happened while I was too busy just showing up. And so I want to thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. And remember, you don't have to feel your best to become your best. You just have to keep showing up. And most importantly, remember, you are still becoming, and you are the only one stopping You. I'll see y'all next week. Bye.